We are 5 down and 4 to go. We just wrapped up part 5 and moving into part 6 with the lesson, The Tribes of the West and the U.S. Government. I'm going to talk fairly quickly because it's a pretty fat PowerPoint. And if you're watching this because you were absent, we started off with the question, what comes to mind when you think of the American West in history? And I put in history there because some people say, well, Washington, Oregon, California, you're not wrong. Or they think of sports divisions. Oh, in football, there's a Western division, and in basketball, there's a Western division. But generally, when people think of the West, they think of cowboys or people playing cowboys and Indians in the 50s or stagecoaches or big Rocky Mountains. There's a game called Oregon Trail, which was a treat for us in elementary school. And you died of dysentery in the game. So older people will probably think of that, or they think of buffalo. And I have been to the American West, and I've seen the Rocky Mountains, and I've seen the buffalo. So for people who have been there, they have, an image in their head, and those who have never been there have a different image. So anyway, here's the question. Why were people heading west? Now, manifest destiny. I know you've already learned about this, but that philosophy remained. Hey, we're going to move west, and it all belongs to us. People saw the West as a land of opportunity to seek your fortune, primarily through farming, ranching, mining, and construction. All really tough gigs. A lot of people wanted to start fresh after the Civil War, which I think you can get. And people had little or no concern for American Indians' rights to the land, okay, which is connected to manifest destiny. So like I said, there were 4 ways of doing it. Farming was really harsh, and it resulted in this method called dry farming, but the people who tried to make their living in farming had to work really, really hard. The conditions were not exactly optimal. And here's some people in Wyoming who put their suits on for their picture, and these are farmers. And the initial people had to live in these sod houses called soddies. So, you were living in really rough conditions, living in a sod house to try to, make your living off the land. Now, some people said, hey, you know what, I'm going to make my money off of cattle. Because, beef is big money, always has been, always will be. And this idea of the cowboys bringing the cows to market, that is true, that is real. And you can see all these networks that emerged in the West because of that industry. Mining, that's a real tough gig. The whole thing collapsing on you and the gases that leak from the earth. But the lure of gold, silver, copper, lead, zinc, asbestos, talc, and borax, people try to make their money that way, and a lot of people did make their money. And then the biggest money item was railroads. And you can see these were the land grants given to railroads. Huge cuts of land in America, and people were driven there to make their living doing that. Here's some people working on the railroads. And the railroads really had a heavy impact. Brought settlers to the West. It allowed Westerners to trade with the East. It was the largest landowner of the West, like that map I just showed you, responsible for the creation of many towns. Unfortunately, it encouraged the slaughter of buffalo. People would just take their rifles out the window and pick off buffalo. They didn't eat them, they didn't use them, just to hurt the American Indians. And obviously, for the American Indians, you're taking my food source and the thing I rely on, we're going to have a problem with that. So the railroads had a real heavy impact, safe to say. Okay, so like I said a minute ago, manifest destiny, I'm heading west, but you can look at these purple regions. These were all Native American pieces of land. Even if you're lousy at geography, you can see there's a lot of different people. And the settlers really didn't care. They wanted that purple land to be their land on a very simple level, which resulted in the Indian Wars. And I think this quote is pretty apropos in looking at the Indian Wars. It makes little difference, however, where one opens the record of history of the Indians. Every page and every year has its dark stain. The story of one tribe is the story of us all. And I think that makes a lot of sense if you get that quote. And the Indian Wars, in reality, if you think about it, the invaders really started in 1493 when Columbus had their first clash with Native Americans, okay? Now, when expansion into the American West, it accelerated the government policy of concentration, meaning let's take these American Indians and put them on reservations. And I've been on some reservations. A lot of them are really poor, a lot of poverty, a lot of sadness. So it was not a happy ending for the vast, vast majority of these people who were concentrated. Kind of a euphemistic term of gross mistreatment. Some tribes peacefully signed treaties with the U.S. government, giving up their lands in exchange for food or payments. Oftentimes it's desperation. Okay, we'll do it. Just feed us. Okay, obviously there's some desperate circumstances to do that. And life on reservations was even worsened by the corrupt Indian agents. These were not the most ethical people. Okay, but in 1862, the U.S. Army began a series of violent conflicts with various Native American tribes. Together, these conflicts are known as the Indian Wars, and the goal of the U.S. policy was to force uncooperative tribes onto reservations and to secure Western lands for white owners. Okay, so we're going to look at a few of these tribes. The Comanche. Now, the Comanche were in the Southwest and Texas and Wyoming, enormous. And some historians consider them historians by conquering, because these were a warlike people and they expanded themselves greatly. Great warrior culture, but in the end, the American Army did win. And at Medicine Lodge Creek, they agreed that the Comanches would settle on a reservation, and it really altered the lives of the Plain Indians forever. Okay, so you probably know the end of this story already. And then we looked at the Navajos and the Apache. Now, the Navajo and the Apache are closely related tribes that descended from a single group that scholars believe migrated from Canada. Now, both Navajo and Apache languages have a similar root. That's the evidence behind that. And you can see these were an extensive group of people all throughout Oklahoma, Kansas, and New Mexico. Okay, and here's an example of a reservation at Bosque Redondo, where the Navajos and the Apache were forced during the Civil War. Here's a real simple rule of history. If you're taking people and putting them into camps or forcing them into one area, it doesn't end well for that people. And you can see this picture says 1,000 words. These people are exposed to the elements, taken off their homelands, and there's American soldiers pointing rifles at them. That's all you need to know. This was not the only place that this went on. So Bosque Redondo is symbolic of this deeper policy that was going on at the time. You look at the Modoc people. Now, the Modoc people originally lived in the area of northeastern California and southern Oregon. Now, the Modoc were powerful warriors and often raided neighbors, and these were a warring people. And you're getting the pattern here. People who the government considered quote-unquote cooperative, in other words, they didn't put up a fight, was different than the people who did. And a lot of these American Indian tribes put up very valiant efforts against the U.S. government, but they were outgunned on a simple level. The Nez Perce people. Now, the North American Indian people whose traditional territory is now northeastern Oregon, Washington, and Idaho. They were the most powerful, the largest, the best known of these people, and they were known for their horsemanship and their horse breeding. In fact, there's breeds of horses today that were created by the Nez Perce people, and they're still very valuable and very good horses. And then the Pacific Coast tribes. Now, there are 29 federally recognized Pacific Coast tribes, highly developed political systems, very prosperous. They had fish and seals and sea otters and whales. They were doing pretty well. And these totem poles that people think of, the totem pole is synonymous with these Pacific Coast peoples. Okay, the Lakota Sioux. This is the largest group in the northern Great Plains and fought many battles against the U.S. Army, known for their horsemanship and their fighting. Now, they're probably the best known because when American Indians became part of the pop culture with these traveling shows and eventually radio shows and movies, they were portraying Lakota Sioux people. So when people just say Indian, oftentimes it's a Lakota Sioux image in their head because, the culture got a hold of it and riffed off it for a really long time. Okay, then we took a little break in class and we watched this 4 or 5 minute video of what happened at Little Bighorn and Wounded Knee. And I asked everybody in class to retell the story. I'm not going to do it for the sake of time, but if you were absent, please watch this video. Again, it's 5 minutes and retell that story. Now, this quote here is a sad quote, but I think it sums up the Indian Wars from the American Indian perspective very well. Chief Joseph, he said, "I am tired of fighting. Our chiefs are killed. It is cold and we have no blankets. The little children are freezing to death. My heart is sick and sad. From where the sun now stands, I will fight no more forever." And you can just hear the exasperation and the frustration and the sadness. And this story went from tribe to tribe to tribe, that their leadership came to the same conclusion. So this Chief Joseph quote is symbolic of this end of the story, okay? Now, in terms on an optimistic side, there is this phenomenon called a ghost dance, and these were part of a religious awakening amongst the Lakota Sioux, and they believed that they returned to their traditional ways. Eventually, they would get their land back. It's almost, I'm not trying to be blasphemous, but there is a parallel for people who are devout Christians. They wait for the rapture. They wait for this change to take place from divinity. I would argue this is very similar, where they're hoping that some divine intervention can come in and improve their situation. I have a little link here for the earliest recordings of the ghost dance if you're interested. I did play it in class. You don't have to if you were absent. It's from the Library of Congress, and I thought it was interesting. A little primary source from a long time ago. Okay, now President Grant did try to bring peace, okay? It was an effort where he tried to create reservations in which tribes could stay and maintain their traditional ways. So in a bit, it's kind of a compromise between, you know, what a lot of people in Congress wanted and obviously what the American Indians wanted, but it didn't really last long. The Dawes Act was the nail in the coffin. This was very detrimental to American Indians. It was passed in 1887. It terminated tribal ownership of most reservation land and allocating some parcels to individual Indians, while most of it was given to American settlers. And this was incredibly detrimental. The nail in the coffin, as I put it, okay? And even worse is the killing of culture. And what happened were these Indian schools, the most famous being the Carlisle Indian School, emerged, were boarding schools where children would show up and they were told they could not speak their language. They had to change their clothing, their hair. Here's an example. Here's one student and the change that they made him do. In fact, if they heard an Indian child speaking their native tongue, they would pull out their tongue with tongs and beat the tongue. It's weird to think about, but they would beat up the tongue to try to kill the Indian in them. You know, it's called, kill the Indian, save the man, right? Okay, so the end results of all of this. Unfortunately for the American Indians, they were forced into reservations. Their traditional ways of life were either endangered, eliminated, or greatly lessened. Again, that expression, kill the Indian, save the man, was a popular expression at the time. Settlers gained access to the best western lands, and the buffalo were hunted for sport, for their furs, and just a way to hurt Indians. And that was an animal that many of these tribes relied on for survival, and the settlers killed these buffalo just for the sake of hurting the Indians, okay? So that ends a fairly long PowerPoint. If you can go to Google Classroom, there are some questions that are related to this. So between this video, between the PowerPoint, and between the book, please answer those. And that is that. So thank you for watching.